everyone. Thanks for coming out on a super cold Thursday night to talk about funeral service planning. Right? We've already heard about funerals with Scott. We heard a little bit last week about first responders, and that was powerful to see. So if you didn't get a chance to be here, you can watch it online. I think it's as powerful to watch that too. Coming up next week, we have Laura Waldock from Northwest Medicine, who's going to talk about palliative care, which a lot of people don't know about. It is not the same as hospice. So she'll be here, and she's also bringing a hospital social worker. What's that? What kind of care? Palliative. Right. Alan's face says it all. Okay. We will learn what palliative means and what kind of niche it fills, because it's completely unique. And a hospital social worker, how nice will it be to find out how you can use this team to your benefit when you're at the hospital? Then we have an attorney who's in the practice behind us here. Stephen Lemon is going to come the next week and talk about papers to have in order. And then we're going to have hospice care the last week. I mean, we're not going to have hospice care, but we are. We're going to learn about some of its gifts. And Sister Laura, who's a deacon, also worked in organ donation. So she'll be able to answer some questions with regard to that too. So many good things. And tonight you get me. So I'm really excited about that. Thank you for your applause. I didn't ask for it at all. Let's start with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Good and gracious God, we thank you for bringing us together. We thank you for the powerful ways we get witnessed to your resurrection and hope through so many different people and so many different things. May it be so tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So here's my little roadmap of what I'm going to cover tonight. I'm going to talk about my theology of funeral services. Then I'm going to talk about planning a service and what it looks like when we have a planning session, and there's a couple of different ways that it happens. Then I'll give you some suggestions for things that you can do ahead of time, because that's kind of been a thread through our classes as well. And of course, I'll open it up for questions. I want you to know that I've probably done, 150 funerals or something, and I carry the people with me in a way, and a lot of times their stories just come bubbling out. And some of them are very funny. And I just want you to know that if I tell any stories, which I probably will, I do it with a lot of respect, and that I really do carry folks with me. And it's a way that they continue to give testimony, which ties right into my theology of funeral services. So there are 4 things that I believe to be true that I carry with me into every funeral planning. And the first is that every person's life gives testimony to God's love, which was revealed in Jesus. Every person's life. Sometimes it's really easy to find. Sometimes it's a little more complicated. Sometimes it's through the gifts that they shared, and other times it's through the challenges. But everyone's life gives testimony to Jesus. Everyone's. The second thing is, I believe that God loves us for all of who we are, and that it's really important to be honest about that. That there are some situations where, there's one that I think about, that it was someone who everyone knew he didn't really go to church very much. And so we have this big, and this wasn't even their church. It's a long, complicated story, but we ended up here, and the first thing I said was, I'm sure you're all wondering why you're in a church and not at a golf course today. Everyone laughed. It took everyone was like, what is she going to say? What is she going to say? And here's why it's so important, because if I really believe that's true about Jesus loving us, every single person, that it's okay to name all of those things, because if I don't name the elephant in the room, then everyone's going to be like, well, if she really knew. If she knew he didn't go to church, then she wouldn't be saying these things about Jesus. It undermines the proclamation of the gospel if there's something there that I'm not addressing. So I think it's okay to tell the truth about someone with gentleness and compassion and love and humor. It's not about airing dirty laundry, but I think it's important to tell the whole story of who someone is. The third thing is There's only one hero in every funeral service, and it's not the person who died, and it's no particular member of the family. It's only Jesus again. That sometimes I feel like in our culture, there's this tendency toward you have to make everyone into the perfect person. And it's like, who's a perfect person? I am not, right? No one is. But sometimes we hear about these horrific shootings. It's enough to say, no one deserves to be shot when they're going about their daily life. They don't. They don't have to be a hero. They don't have to have saved their neighborhood or taken in children. Doesn't matter. No, there's only one hero, and it's Jesus. And that's really important because sometimes families can say, I did all of these things. You have to be careful when you navigate that and make sure Jesus is the hero. And the final thing is that the liturgy can be trusted. So those pieces of the service, and there's not a lot of liturgy. I'm going to show you a funeral service. There's not a lot of liturgy, but it all has a purpose. And it's really clear, and we can trust that the words that gave encouragement to our ancestors in faith will give encouragement to us too. So that's my theology of funeral services. Now, some of you have planned funeral services with me. Did I live out my theology? A little bit, yeah? Good. It's something that I've developed over the years. So it's that framework that I carry in. So here's one thing that a lot of people ask me is, do you do funerals for people you don't know? My answer is yes, all the time. So I looked back at last year. I had 13 funerals. 3 of them were people that were part of the congregation that I knew very well, that I was very engaged with them all the way around the time of death and those kinds of things. Lots of really meaningful family time with their families. And in some ways, I felt kind of like part of the family. So there were 3 of those. There were 3 that were members of the congregation, but kind of tangential. I wasn't involved in any of those end-of-life kinds of things. 3 were people that reached out to the funeral homes and asked for me because of other connections in the community, and then 4 were complete and total. I answered the phone on a Friday. Do any other pastors work on Fridays, Scott? When the funeral home's calling, sometimes I'm like, I learned to ask. I'm like, are you asking for me, or am I the only pastor that's answering my phone on Friday? And so then we engaged. So that's kind of so there were 7 people that I really didn't know at all going into the planning process. And so there are a couple of things that are different going into a planning process where I don't know anyone than when I do. Those families where we had been together over the last couple of weeks and months before their death, and some of them I knew a long time before that as well, I don't have to hear a lot of stories. I had heard a lot of stories. I had my own relationship with them, which can be its own challenge, honestly. Sometimes it's easier not to know anyone and just to be listening. But when it's someone that I don't know well, the first thing we do is we'll meet up here at church, and I'll say, so tell me some stories. She's been in funeral planning with me, that's why she's laughing. So tell me some stories. So there's any number of things. Usually the way that it goes is people start telling stories. And they usually start with the really safe ones. She was a really nice person and she did these good things. And then, a couple of questions or someone will kind of roll their eyes or whatever and you'll go, I think there's a little bit more to this story. Do you want to tell me a little bit more? The best funeral planning has the staff wondering, what is going on in there? I thought you were doing funeral planning, because we're laughing, we're crying, all of the feelings are being expressed, and we usually get pretty quickly to the underneath. Sometimes what happens in this story time is dynamics are revealed, and you can feel something happening in the room, and it's something to pay attention to as well, but you don't always get to know what's going on with that, right? And but usually it's just storytelling, and I'm listening for how did their life give testimony to how Jesus' love, right? And sometimes we don't know if they were baptized. We don't know if they ever went to church. There was one family, I'm 100% sure, they came into the church, they had cremains. So they called me out of the blue. I don't know why they called this church, but they came in and I said, I'm not sure why you want to be in a church, because it was clear that they were going to a bar after, and like that's where the real party was going to happen. And they're like, well, because you'll know what to say. And I was like, I hope I know what to say in this moment, right? So our church gives testimony. The second they walked in, they're like, well, look at it. Like, you know what to say. Beautiful. So we never know exactly what to expect from those things. So after the storytelling is over, there's usually a shift in the room, and sometimes the family will be like, are we going to plan a service today, or are we just going to talk? But then I'll pull out bulletins, and the first one I'll give you, I'll print out bulletins ahead of time. So if it's a church funeral, I'll print out the church funeral bulletins, and if it's a funeral home funeral, I'll print out funeral home bulletins, and some of you have seen these, so I'll keep one for myself. But I pull together the bulletins here at GLC, and the way I think about funeral bulletins is I think people take them home and they become keepsakes, because I know that people have come to funeral planning and they have funeral bulletins from other churches and they're like, here's things I like, and Scott is nodding affirmatively, so I think he's probably seen that too. So the first thing we look at is the cover. You know that you can put a picture on the cover, and on the back we always put the obituary, and sometimes families will write a special obituary for the bulletin. And then we can put other pictures, and you can see Art. Some of you might have known Art, and he's got all his family pictures, and families are busy gathering pictures at this time anyway, so it's not usually hard for people to find lots of pictures of special moments with their family. So we have the pictures on the front and on the back. We have occasionally had to do inserts too, if people wanted to write a whole story. It's just another way to tell the story. So then we get to the inside. And every funeral, you can have anywhere from 2 to 4 hymns. I went to a funeral about 8 weeks ago for a retired pastor. 8 hymns, and they were all really big. Do you know how hard it is to sing 8 really big hymns? It was like, I know that 8 hymns, it was a lot of hymns. Too many, nope. You will not be singing 8 hymns here. 2 to 4, right, depending on how. And then there's places for special music and things like that. And every once in a while, the choir will pull out something special, or the bells have played for, I think one funeral service, it was someone that was in the bells. So 2 to 4 hymns, that's a great way for you to contribute to your future funeral planning, because more and more families don't have a wide knowledge of church music sometimes, and they're like, I'm not sure what to pick. But I would encourage you to take a hymnal home and listen to there's recordings of all of these hymns, easy to find, and listen to them as if you're your family, right? Listening to those words. And some of them are kind of family hymns that you sing at funerals, Children of the Heavenly Father. Every time I start to hear it here, I'm like, oh, I think of all the funerals that it's played at. We don't do that as much anymore, but it was a Swedish hymn, and so that was kind of a thing. If we have a body, we will usually do a time of visitation before the service in here, even if there was a visitation at the funeral home the night before. And then we process in when there's a body. When it's cremains, we just quietly take it in, whether it's us here or there's a funeral home. We take it in and we put a picture up front in cremains, and there's usually floral arrangements and things like that. But we process from back here. We have a funeral pall, which is a big white cloth. Have you all seen that? That covers the casket so that it's a sign of our baptism being completed. And it's really kind of beautiful. And I told my kids, I don't care what you do with my body, but my body needs to be present at the funeral. After that, you can cremate it if you want, but for me, that's kind of an important thing, and I think funeral homes will do that, right? I want my body at the funeral. Just give me one of those rental caskets. Then you can do what you want.
Can you tell us why?
Why?
Yeah, why do you feel that way?
Because our bodies matter when they're alive. For me, I remember, this is going to happen. Genevieve Ott, on the day she died, she got her hair done. She said goodbye to all of her friends down at the homestead. She went to lunch, and then I came for the, final communion visit, and she's like, I've done everything. When is it going to happen? Her body mattered a whole lot that day, right? There was something really beautiful. No judgment if you want cremains at your funeral. But for me, that's why there's something about it, like our bodies matter. They're not just containers. Like they're the containers that hugged people, and they're the containers that that did all of this, right? The container matters. It's not just an empty vessel for me. So, yeah.
So with that said, you like an open casket then too?
Open casket for visitation, but we close it before a service. Although when I do funeral home services, sometimes they're not. And one time, she asked about open caskets. I'm not repeating the question like I'm supposed to. I'm sorry, Faith. We had, you would know what it's called, Scott, but she was just laid on a table. So she wasn't in a casket at all. She was going to be cremated, but for the service, it was during COVID. It was very small group. And so she was just laid out on a table with a blanket over her. It was beautiful, actually. Yeah, I like open caskets for most situations, but sometimes
it's a closure.
It is kind of a closure to have a casket. And during COVID, another thing that we did the visitation in there. For some of the services, we could only have 50 people here. And this is a close space. And so we did the visitations in there. And we would go into close and put the pall on. And we told people, if you just want to bow your head and pray, if you want to. And most people, in fact, I don't think anyone left. I think people found it kind of moving to, a closure moment. But yourself and your family and do what feels right to you. But that's my personal choices for. My interns are also going to do my funeral service, so all of them together. Because my rule is it has to be someone who knows me really well because they have to tell the truth about me. I do not want a pastor up there saying, oh, she was so wonderful. And I'm like, she's not always wonderful. And I think it'll be a whole lot more fun for my family if it's someone who will tell the truth. I know, isn't that awful? Anyway, so we'll do a procession in if there's a casket. And we have that opening greeting and prayer of the day, which is part of the liturgy. The invocation for baptism up at the top is something that we usually only do at the church. And that's if we know someone is baptized and all of that. So that's something we would do from the back. Then we process in. And then we do the greeting and prayer of the day from the front. Then it's time for memories of family and friends. Okay, what is the right number of people to speak at a funeral? I'll give you a range. Becky says 1 to 2. Depends on how long they speak, Alan says. Yeah? I say 1 to 3, but make sure they represent different aspects of your life. So maybe one child and one friend and one sibling, for instance, can be a really nice rounded out. But one is fine too. Sometimes every family has a designee, right? That's our family speaker. They're going to talk at every funeral forever. But I think it's a really special thing. And a lot of times people say, oh, I don't think I can do it. In fact, I had a woman one time and she was talking in the planning. She's like, I don't think I can do it. I'm like, you can do it. And I said, you know what? If you can't, either have someone else to designate to hand your thing to or hand it to me. And I was sitting up in the choir loft and she was standing at the lectern and she looks at me and she's like, I can't do it. And I'm like, you can do it. And she's like, I can? Yes, you can. I think it's really meaningful when people cry and when they share story. I think it's just really beautiful. And so if they're willing to do it, I think it helps frame up that life in a really special way. And it's also a great place for reading special poems, if there's something like that. But I think it's really a nice thing. I have occasionally, if people were really, they're like, you know, we really want more of an open mic kind of feel, I would do that before the service as a frame up, because it can kind of, because then the service kind of reins it in. People really do like more structure than maybe they even realize they like. So sometimes knowing that the service is coming, and when I stand up to start the service, they're like, okay, we're ready. They like that clear delineation. The one that I had the hardest time with was actually connected to one of the funeral homes. They're like, look, you are going to have your work cut out for you because everyone in our family likes to talk and they are all going to think they have something to say. And they did. They were not lying. So they're like, but they gave me permission to stand up when I felt it was right and say, all right, we're going to continue with the service now. And I did. I'm like, we all have stories we could tell. The room is full of them. Just feel them. And then one more guy was like, I have one more thing to say. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. But he kept it really brief, which I appreciated. And then we could go on with the service. But I think they're really beautiful. So 1 to 3 people. Did you have a question, Alan?
No,
you looked like you were thinking one.
Thinking that you're saying if you do my funeral, you're going to stand up and tell the truth about me.
Ah!
I don't know if I want you to do that.
Alan is not sure he wants me to tell the truth about him. Here's the thing, Alan, we all know it.
Fair enough.
But remember, the more important thing that I'm going to say is how much Jesus loved you and how we saw God's love through you, because we see that too. Don't make me say nice things about you, Alan. It's really awkward. No, you're right. Then we get to readings. And this is another area where you can be really helpful to your family to pick a few readings that are really important to you. Because more and more, you know, someone will just look at me with, I have no idea. I don't know what kind of readings to choose. And so then I'll say, you know what? I'm happy to pick them for you. And I've never had anyone say, nope, those readings are terrible. I reject them. But usually it'll be something connected to their story in a special way. So we find a reading that really connects to how they proclaimed. And there's some really interesting ones. There was one guy he actually poured the concrete at the Sears Center. And there's a foundation, one in Corinthians. I laid a foundation and someone built on it and someone built on it. I'm not quoting exactly right, but that's what, oh, man, was that powerful. And I still think of it every time. He also did a lot of gas stations, and so you have to have the slope just right. I cannot tell you, I cannot pass a gas station without thinking about Bob. I'm like, I wonder if Bob did that gas station with the slope. Yeah. Anyway, any questions about readings or how you might find them? I can be helpful with this too. I think I'm kind of an underutilized resource, to be honest, sometimes. That people feel like, oh, you're busy, I don't want to call you. No, you should always call me. With not just end-of-life stuff, but with just transitions, it can be helpful to have someone else listen. So, but if you want to plow through scripture with me, I'm happy to do that as well. So any questions on what we've covered so far? Is it a lot? Or is it kind of what you expected? All right, then a message. And I never do storytelling at funerals, and I never memorize. It's all from the pulpit because I think it's really important. I think it can become a distraction otherwise. And usually short, 7-ish minutes maybe, but just right to the point. Because you've already heard all these things about their life. My job is just to kind of pull it together. Hey, Lamps, how are you? I'm glad you're here. We'll catch up, I promise. Yeah. No, it was at 7. That's okay. You're all right. You're all right. We've got plenty more to cover. All right, then we move into, after the sermon, oh, do you have an extra? Thank you. So this is one of our funeral bulletins from here at GLC, but you also have been to a funeral here. Two funerals? Engel King, I know. Steve?
Someone that we lived in the same place in Elgin.
Okay. So their punch card is getting full of Pastor Trudy funerals. So you kind of know the ropes. Anyway, then we get it back into the liturgy, the Apostles' Creed, prayers, and then if you choose to have communion at your service, I'm even more explicit in the invitation to communion than I am on Sunday mornings. And I usually say something like, if you would eat at Art's table, you're welcome at this table. And that kind of opens things up for people too. But it's also great if there are family members who will serve communion. It can be really, really meaningful. And that makes people more likely to come up for communion as well, or at least receive a blessing. And then the creed, and again, music can be woven through the communion, after the sermon, for hymns, sometimes special music. And then we end with a commendation, and then if there's a casket again, we recess. Military honors, we will do them in the church. And the last ones that we had, although they're getting more and more rare, right? Because the generation of people that everyone served in the military, but we will do them in the church. We actually did it up front because it was live streamed. Do you remember how long ago that was? It wasn't Arts, was it? Anyway, but we did it right up front so that everyone could see, but often we'll do it at the back of the church. But I think it's something important. If we're giving testimony to everyone, all of who someone is, their military service is a really important part of that. But I know some churches get a little wonky about it. There's a different ceremony at graveside, yeah. So
at John's father-in-law's, they had it at the church.
okay, maybe Scott can clear it up. Are there two distinct services?
There can be a military service, and then there's the folding of the flag.
Yeah.
And that's usually done at the gravesite. Or
So-
at the conclusion of services here,
Yeah.
there would be cremation.
So we would do the folding of the flag. We usually do the folding of the flag here, but we did a gun salute at Irv Zar's at the graveside.
Oh, really?
But yeah, I guess I have seen the flag folding at graveside too. So it just depends on their availability, but the funeral homes are super helpful in navigating all of that. Yeah. So, but yeah, Irv's, did you go graveside at Irv's? Yeah, yeah, he had the 21. Yeah, so we'll do military honors. Are there any, okay, what are some of your general questions about a service here?
Do you ring the bells?
Do we ring the bells? We don't exactly have the capacity to ring the bells. It's a carillon, so we don't. Yeah, we could. I mean, I think we have a remote control, honestly, that runs the bells. It's like this big because the carillon is old. So we could, but yeah, honestly, I haven't even thought about it. It's not, no. No, and honestly, I hadn't even thought about it, so. But I guess churches used to do that when they'd, do the, why didn't anyone tell me?
From like a 50s black and white movie.
All right, a 50s, and they're never wrong in movies about funerals. They're always right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we could ring the carillon bells. Yeah.
What about with the music, when people are requesting non-religious music?
Oh, what about requesting non-religious music? That's a really good question. I mean, I think within certain bounds, but there's a lot of really appropriate music. There was someone who had died by suicide, and there's a song, and right now it's slipping my mind, but it was perfect. And it's what they wanted, and it was really important. And I think for me, it's about trusting the power of the gospel, trusting that Jesus is bigger than a whole lot of stuff, and why would I fight about stuff like that? So I think all kinds of, but I mean, obviously there could be lines that, you know, could be crossed, I guess, but most people understand appropriate to, they're not going to ask for something that's inappropriate. But that song, I wish I could remember off the top of my head, was really, really beautiful. Yeah, but there's no shortage of good music. But yeah, I'm totally okay with, because is there any secular music, or does everything belong to God? Oh, that was good, right? Yeah. Pushes our boundaries. Yeah, any other questions about that? And I'll talk about a funeral home service now.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah.
A solo one here.
Yeah.
Do you provide somebody to, or provide names of people?
Yeah, we have a solo. Honestly, it started happening a whole lot more, obviously, in the pandemic, because for a while we weren't singing. So Amy was singing on our behalf, so Amy was almost always our soloist. So, I mean, that's where we would start. But like Craig Dessens has done it as well, for those of you who know him. But we can certainly find people to do it, to do solos or other special music. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for asking. So yeah, we can help you find. And that's a great place to put other kinds of music too. And we can play it over the sound system. But most people like live music, right? But we can, yeah. Other questions? Good ones.
I have one.
Yeah.
What kind of service would you do for a non-believer?
What kind of service would you do for a non-believer? That is a great question. I believe everyone's life gives testimony to God's love, which is revealed in Jesus. And I hold to that. I did one not that long ago, actually, that apparently she was Jewish, but she was a ward of the state, and so there were cremains, which is not a Jewish funeral anyway. We navigated it with a lot of support from her family of what they were comfortable with and what I was comfortable with, and it turned out to be really interesting. It was really interesting. But I've said that there are people that I don't know, and I don't know what they believed, but I know what I believe about Jesus. How big is it? How big is what Jesus did? Big enough. So I'm going to say it was big enough to love them, big enough to receive them. You think about also people, even if they had been baptized and maybe they went to church as a kid and now they're in the throes of addiction and they die of an overdose. What kind of a dark and difficult place is that to be in? Where does God go? Dark and difficult places. I have no problem proclaiming, I believe they were just gathered up. And I always think, too, about who else is there, especially, when there's an overdose and the room is full of young people. What do you think? Some of those other people were with them. What do you think they need to hear? That when they were at their darkest, I believe they were wrapped up in Jesus' arms. So it's a good question. And kind of a corollary question is, what do you do when someone says, don't have a service for me? And this is a really hard thing, and I put it in the category of be thoughtful about the promises you ask people to make. And I think it's worth exploring when someone says to you, I don't want a service. Why don't you want a service? Tell me more about that. I mean, depending on how your family talks. My family does not talk like that. Pastor Trudy talks like that, but my family doesn't talk like that. But the more you can have an honest conversation about what is it about, are they concerned that I don't have enough money to cover it? Do they not want people to gather around because they felt like, I don't want them saying a whole bunch of things about me that aren't true, right? I don't want them to feel like they have to do that. It's uncomfortable for me, right? And you might find something else. Maybe they're nervous about just the idea of, I don't feel like I'm a very good person. And I don't know if I want a bunch of people. I don't know other reasons that people might have, but I put it in the category of be careful what you ask people to promise. But it's worth exploring because it's not for the person who died, it's for the people who are left and what they need. Yeah.
I've seen numerous times where someone will have a visitation, and then it'll say graveside services, just private. Do you do some kind of a graveside service for people?
So the question is, some people will do a visitation and then a graveside service. Yeah, I've done a private graveside service, absolutely, and can make it quite a bit of a service, actually. I mean, it can be, say a few words. I think one of the most meaningful things at the graveside when there hasn't been another service is for people to just say a few words. Is that a service? I don't know. I mean, I say some scriptures and things like that, but really beautiful, really meaningful. There's something about standing there, too, at graveside. So yeah, absolutely, I've done some of those. Yeah. It's a good question. Did someone else have a question? All right, here's a funeral home funeral. And hopefully some of you can share. You'll see there's not a whole lot of differences. There are definitely some, for church folk, to have a church funeral is really special. But funeral homes have their own, there's something about being all in one place and going right from the visitation into the service, like the energy of the room, and you've got all the pictures around you. We can do the pictures and stuff in here too. But there's something about it. So we just have more of the service printed. Often there's less music. This one had just Fields of Gold by Sting. Hey, look at that. An example of, secular music, if there is such a thing. God's music, but maybe that wasn't written that way. So it's a little bit simpler form. We start out with a greeting and the prayer, just like here, but we didn't have a Thanksgiving for baptism. And then just everything was a little more simplified. Just one reading. And then you can see the printed words of the commendation, which weren't printed in the other one. And I think there's something really special about the commendation. And I usually will stand either at the urn or at the casket. Let us commend Taylor to the mercy of God, our Maker and Redeemer, and everyone. Into your hands, O merciful Savior, we commend your servant Taylor. Acknowledge, we humbly beseech you, a sheep of your own fold, a lamb of your own flock, a sinner of your own redeeming. Receive him into the arms of your mercy, into the blessed rest of everlasting peace, and into the glorious company of the saints in light. And then we go to the luncheon. Yeah. We do have luncheons here as well, which is a really important part of the whole thing, I think. And most funeral homes, I think, now do luncheons as well. Right there in the funeral home. And it's nice, we always think, of course they could go to a restaurant, but there's something about being in a church basement. Just feels right. And they don't have to rush, and everyone can. And then they get the carry-out containers. But our team downstairs also knows how to read a room and how to start packing things up and moving things along. And sometimes I feel like that's the biggest part of what maybe funeral directors and pastors do, is we kind of keep things moving along, because sometimes people aren't like, they're like, I don't want to stay here, but I don't know how to go to the next step. And so it's kind of like, okay, we're going the next step together. And then it's like the next step together, and then the next step. Yeah, so it's not so different. All right, what other questions do you have? Yes, Scott.
Is there a committee then at GLC that kind of handles funeral luncheons and coordinates those things?
Yeah, right now Julie is the one that does that. She coordinates it. I'll repeat the question. Thank you. Do we have a committee of people that do funeral luncheons? Julie coordinates it, but we have a really great team of volunteers. And depending, because I say yes to so many funerals that aren't members, for members or people that are really well affiliated with the congregation, we'll ask for everything except main course. Families always buy the main course, but there's a whole variety of things they can get. But then salads and desserts and everything. But sometimes for folks from outside, they'll bring in more of the food. But we usually will still do desserts and coffee and lemonade and things like that. And providing the space, I think, sometimes is the most important thing. Art Black had, what is the Chinese restaurant over on the? Jen Ho. Jen Ho, yep.
That's different.
Art Black. Yes. So sweet. But we had so much food. It was crazy. The family way over-ordered. Yeah. But it was good. But Julie is even helpful with, I think this is also a really hard thing for families. And I don't know that there's anything you can do about this ahead of time. But so Julie's like, find out how many people there are going to be. Find out how many people there are going to be. And I'm like, do you think I didn't ask? Right? They're going to give me the same. So actually, usually we have kind of a system is like, are you expecting less than 50? Are you expecting 50 to 75? And people are usually comfortable getting into one of those ranges, right? But I would say this. We've had some big funerals here, and the biggest luncheon we've had is like 110. So rarely do all the people that are here stay for the luncheon. And so, I mean, Marty's funeral was like that. It was a big funeral, but I think that was one of our bigger luncheons, and Irv Czar's.
You used to make a joke, old people would go to the funeral just for the lunch.
Old people would, I don't know if I should repeat this on the camera. Some people would say that old people would just go to the funerals for the luncheon. That's only the Haugies. No, I'm just kidding.
Hard times.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Other questions or wonderings that you have about funeral service planning? So what are your two things that you can do? Pick hymns and pick readings. That's super helpful. You can have, your best headshot. Family pictures. Always take family pictures.
I have too many.
Yeah, but I mean, do you know how many people, though, there are that, there will be one particular person in the family that takes all the pictures and there's not any pictures of them. I'm pretty sure it's going to be me. There's not going to be any pictures of me with my family. It's like, well, we know she was there. Yeah. So have I answered all the questions that you have?
I mean, the first time I ever seen a reading from Revelation at a funeral.
A reading from Revelation? Actually, Revelation is a pretty common book because it's got the verse, no more crying, no more pain, no more, yeah. So it's a really nice, in the garden there will be this tree of life. It's a beautiful reading, yeah. New heaven and a new earth, the home of God is among mortals. Yeah, mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. Yeah, it's actually a really hopeful book. I think people don't think that. But sometimes I'll choose unusual readings for people and just ask them to trust me. Yeah.
Because I know it came up
kids from, mixed families and.
How to handle difficult family situations. Well, I touched on it a little bit in the planning as feeling for dynamics, but it's really, really hard because you know what? Here's the thing. Most people are trying to just protect other people's feelings. And sometimes they're trying to protect themselves a little bit too. And so you don't want to be invasive in someone's business. But handling it very carefully. There was one family that had that exact situation where it was 2 marriages and the one marriage had ended by the other relationship beginning. So all these people are in the room, right? The kids that were in the first marriage. But he had done some of his funeral planning. And I almost should have looked it up because I should have known this question would come. But he picked a reading that was really, really strange, really unusual. But it really spoke to the tension in the room. And I was like, dang. And I saved it. I didn't have anyone read it because I think it would have been really hard to hear, just read like that. But I wrapped it in the context of the sermon. And I said, we know he was a planner. Does anyone think this was unintentional? It was intentional. It was his way kind of apologizing, of taking some responsibility. I mean, it was really powerful. But I think the best, like at some point, if you know there's that tension, you have to speak to it. Have to speak to it. But it's happened in any number of ways. But that's the one that, I mean, he helped me do it. And I will say this, that so many times, and Steve's funeral was actually like this. There was a lot of tension in our planning because he had died unexpectedly. And there was some tension in the family about that we got really hung up on communion. And it was about, he didn't come to church. He wouldn't want communion at his funeral. Like, that's ridiculous. And the other one was like, but I want communion. I want communion, and I want it to be shared with the people that are there. And I said, you know what? Everyone's going to go home. We're going to sleep on it. We're going to pray about it. And we're going to trust that the next day I got a phone call from the son-in-law, because Steve was the person that would have made those decisions. He was the one. We could feel his presence not there, right? We're all like, come on, Steve, tell us what to do. And he did. And it was really clear, and no one doubted that it was Steve letting his voice be known through our planning. His son-in-law called and said, we're going to have communion, and we're going to have this reading, and we're going to do this. And it was like, okay, beautiful. So I think a lot of times in those really tense situations that's something that will happen. But it happened in my own, I've preached at my dad's funeral and my mom's funeral. Very different kinds of people, but my grandfather had been remarried. And his second wife is sitting there, and I am the grandchild of his first wife, right? And I'm looking at my people and I'm like, how is this gonna go down? Because they're very different women too. And both of them, feisty as all get out. I know that's shocking to think I come from a family of people like that. Oh my goodness. So I'm standing there, I'm like, all right, what am I gonna say? And here's what I did. My grandpa was a farmer. And I talked, of course I had the sowing the seed was the parable, that was the gospel. But I talked about Kairos time and Chronos time. Chronos time is the time we tell on our watches. Kairos time is God's time. And I said, you know who understands God's time as farmers? Do you know how many times he drove in circles around a field? How do you do that? And it was his sons first next to him, and then it was his grandsons next to him, and then it was the most amazing thing. He lived in Kairos time most of the time. So I'm like, in Kairos time, Grandma will be there and Ivy will be there, and somehow it will all be okay. And I trust that, right? It's about how big is what Jesus did. Is it big enough to cover that? It is. Whatever family dynamics might be present, is it big enough? for those. I think the other hard one that I had one time was someone that everyone knew that she struggled with alcohol. She was very young. She's only in her early 50s. Extremely young, let me say. She was only in her 50s. And we're sitting there, and I didn't know how she had died, right? It was one of those, like, I actually think another pastor was like, hey, can you do this one for me? And I said, sure, because I say that a lot. And I'm meeting with them, and I said, she was really young. And these looks go around the table. And someone's like, we need to tell her. And someone's like, we can't tell her. She wouldn't want her to tell her. And I'm like, hold up. You really need to tell me, and you need to trust me with it. And they're like, well, she really struggled with alcohol. She struggled with alcohol, and it's like, maybe we need to bring that out of the closet now. Everyone who was gathered that day knew it. Everyone knew it. She didn't keep a secret from anyone. And it's like I said, if I go up there and act like she didn't have any problems, all good. No, she had a problem, and it was really lonely to have that problem. And I would hate to think that any of you would be that lonely. Let's be supportive of each other the way we wanted to be supportive of her. I don't know, it's hard. Yeah, other questions?
If you have a showing and a visitation and you're going to be cremated, it's going to take a few weeks before you get the ashes back for an interment. And then there is another ceremony at the gravesite.
A showing and a visitation, and then you're cremated after, and then it takes a little time, and then you do have to do internment at another time. Yeah. How long does it take, Scott?
It can be as soon as the next day.
Okay.
Really?
You have the cremated remains back.
So it can be as soon as a day, or it can be longer. Sometimes people will do the service as quickly as possible, and then they might do the burial later when they get the stone, for instance. Yeah. Yeah, so we had one last December. He had died early in the year, and she died mid-year. And then we did a memorial service for her here, and then Oak Hill was ready for them to be buried. It was really sweet. They brought sand from Florida for Mom, and branches from a tree from Dad, because he liked trees and she liked sand. And so they put it half and half, and they put the boxes in, and they were like, "Kunk." And they're like, oh, Dad is going to be so mad at us for having his box crooked. We have to turn them the other way. And they're like, but then Dad will be touching the sand. He never stepped foot on sand his whole life. But we did. They're like, well, he's going to touch sand now. It was really sweet. It was, well, looks like that's what we're going to have to do. So that was really meaningful. But they waited for the stone to be ready. And then we did it all then. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
This is more of what if. If you had someone that hadn't been baptized and died, would you do a baptism and a funeral at the same time?
If you had someone that hadn't been baptized, we don't baptize people when they're not alive.
Okay.
Yeah. However, I'll just say sometimes things are really important to people. And if I say, how big is what Jesus did? How big is Jesus? If it's really important to someone. There was someone who, Catholics won't do a final, once someone's been dead a certain amount of time. Anyone know how long it is? There's a certain period of time after which they won't do last rites anymore. They don't call them last rites. It's anointing of the sick. So you can have them anytime, and they actually recommend that you have them anytime. Have them don't wait until the last moment to have anointing of the sick. But it was really important to the family. I was doing the funeral, but she had been raised Catholic, and it was a complicated mess. But did I go and bless her? She'd been dead for yeah, of course. I don't know. I could be making all the wrong decisions. I just want to make that clear. But I told you what the standards that I'm operating out of, right? And for me, that's really clear. But it doesn't mean that everyone would approve of my decisions. Call the bishop. Yeah. It's on the recording. Shoot. Photographic evidence. Yeah, other questions that you might have about your own planning or about our philosophy here about things?
It's a trick to figure out readings, like, it's so big.
Yeah, figuring out readings can be really challenging. It's a little bit of a trick. And I will say that I know that a lot of people like to pre-plan, and there's some real meaningful stuff in that, but there's also something really meaningful when a family gathers around to try to pick things too. So sometimes people will just have a list. So you don't have to narrow it down to just the readings at your service. You could provide a list of readings and say, these are scriptures that have been important to me in your life, and then trust your family to know what will be meaningful to them at that point. So you don't have to pick exactly. Or you can say, these are hymns that I really like, and let them choose from among them. So I think you're right. You don't have to pick the reading. Yeah, I don't even know what I'd choose. I love to tell the story, I think, for a song. Yeah. And I also told my kids, so I don't even know if this is true. I read it somewhere. Parishioners go in one way, pastors go in another. Is it true? So pastors go in head first, right? Yeah, so if you're standing up, you'd be facing the congregation. So if I stand up in my casket, I'll be facing the right way. That's the goal. It really is true. So my poor kids, oh my gosh. I was like, you have to make sure I'm pointing the right way. So my interns better make sure I'm pointing the right way. You know what? I kind of want to have a pre-funeral just to see what they would do and say. I think you're all going to want to come to my funeral because I think it's going to be amazing. They're going to do a really good job. Other things, other questions you might have?
How about the general length of this service? And, how many people can you add that want to talk? Do you have a time limit? Or?
No, you know what? I trust that. Do you have a time limit for the people that speak? Most services tuck right into an hour. I said a little bit earlier, 1 to 3 people speaking, but I trust the process. And there are times when it can get uncomfortably long, but I also think I have part of the thing about doing this a long time, someone said it to me a couple Sundays ago. They're like, you had a baptism and we were still out in 50 minutes. And I'm like, did you hear anything in the sermon or, I don't know, like a hymn? Were you just watching your clock? No. So it's like you get kind of a sense of the time of things. I don't know how it happens, but it usually works out to be an hour. I think most people have some kind of a clock in them too, where they're like, oh, this is getting a little long or whatever. But yeah, I've never had, but that's the only variable in a service usually is how many people are here, and if we have communion, that'll take a little bit longer. And then if we have extra pieces of music or something like that, or people speaking. But usually people are pretty respectful. Yeah, one son one time, he's like, my dad told me I could talk for 5 minutes, and he's like, it's just not gonna work like that. I was like, okay. You're dealing with him for the rest of your life, right? I mean, with him coming back to you saying, I told you to speak for 5 minutes. Yeah, it was fun. He's like, it's my dad and I'm going to talk as long as I want. Fair. I don't usually put limits on people, but because you want to let them speak. Does that answer your question? Yeah, 1 to 3 people representing different parts of your life.
At my dad's funeral, several of the grandchildren also wanted to talk. When
Oh.
one was speaking, there were several more that wanted to talk and participate.
So she was talking about grandchildren coming to the, wanting to talk. There was a really sweet one time when a whole bunch of them went up. And they kind of did a pass the mic and told stories and stuff, and it was really sweet. I thought it was, and it was so appropriate for their family. Like, this is how they did it. We'd sit down and we'd be passing and everyone would be talking and stuff. So people have a way the funerals have a way of becoming so appropriate for the person that you're celebrating. So yeah, but I can totally see lots of people wanting to talk, and but there's a lot of ways to handle it. Sometimes you can ask people to write. Sometimes I'll say, you know what, how about you guys write something and we'll put it in and write a story or something. But yeah.
Well, this is to both of you. Is there a monetary component to the church? And then if there's a funeral part of the funeral home, is there a more than just the visitation, a monetary component there?
Is there a monetary component to the church part? When we're working with a funeral home, the funeral home will usually charge everything. And that usually will include Debbie, if she's playing. They'll usually most families will give me something, and if there's a soloist. But families handle giving the church something. We handle the bill for the food, for the main course. So something like that. But we don't I've tried this, it's really hard. Funeral homes do it much better. But to hand someone a price list just has never felt right to me. And sometimes I think people are here because they got cremains if they were on Medicaid or whatever, so they don't have a lot of resources to, what are you gonna do, So we're certainly not gonna say no to someone.
Is there usually like a suggested donation though? Or?
Yeah, we'll usually make a suggestion. If people ask, one thing I will say, you have to give Debbie this, you have to give Amy this. But anything else is, and if they ask for suggestions on that. But I think it's part of what, when we think about it as a congregation and supporting the budget and everything, I think that's part of what we support, is so that we can be that to our community. So, am I reading that right in our congregation? Like, we're happy to be able to be a place where people can find that kind of support. Yeah.
And how about the funerals then? Beyond the visitation, is there more for having the funeral then?
If there's, like on the second day, then generally there would be an additional charge for that other day, or an extended time. If the visitation is 2 hours and then you have a service that goes to the cemetery, there would be a charge for that then too. And funeral homes will have a general price list, and that'll list all of that out.
So the question was, do funeral homes have a price list like that? And they do. And you can pick and choose different components, and depending on how many different times you're there. It's probably not unlike weddings. I hate to connect weddings and funerals, but right? You can choose this or that if you're there for this many hours or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Really good questions.
At what point do you get involved? Is it just for the funeral planning, or is it before the funeral when the person is?
That's a really great question. At what point do I get involved? It's whenever the family invites me to be involved. So you heard, of the 13 funerals, 7 of them, I just got it was the funeral home saying, are you available on this day at this time? Sure. But 3 of them, I was very involved in end of life and all of that kind of stuff. And the part that we don't need to do then often at funeral planning is the storytelling. If we've been sitting around in a hospital room and telling stories, and then we don't need to tell so many stories. But it's important to make sure everyone is at the planning who wants to be at the planning. So sometimes we have to do that too. Who is missing? Whose voice didn't get heard? And sometimes, and that was actually a question that I think Joyce was getting at, if she went to a funeral where this person had one life for 50 years and then like everything changed and then they kind of had another life. And they only told about one part of the life. I mean, and whoever you're planning with, but I always, because we had an experience in our family where it just really went off in a bad direction. It was really hurtful to the family because they only told this one side of the story. So I'm hyper aware of that. So I think I'll tread cautiously and have a pretty neutral presence if I'm really not sure. But yeah, it's hard. But it's hard, and you don't blame the family that was planning it either. I mean, they don't know what their life was like before. You know, there's some people that they have no idea what their childhood was like. They're like, I don't know what my grandpa's childhood was like. We have no idea. It's like he just dropped onto the earth at age, 25. We have no idea what he was like before that. So tell stories too. Write things down. So they might know some of those stories too. There's a lot of tools out there to do that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm aware of our time, but I'm happy to answer other questions. Yeah. So thank you again for your attention. I hope all this was helpful, but no, call me anytime. Buy me lunch. I'll answer whatever questions you have. Yeah, right? See how that works? But like I said, some of you have been at funerals that I've done. You've been in planning. It can be challenging, but it's really also holy, and there's something about it.
They have a long list of hymns, and you're not letting them sing all of them.
You have a long list of hymns? All right. Here's the thing, though. Rules are made to be... But when we're planning your funeral, we're going to be like, you know which one I'm going to sing, though? We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord. There's a song that every time we'd sing it, Louise is like, I hate this song. We used to sit in here. I can't get the rhythm of this song. I might have my own list for your funeral, Louise. Should I be so privileged to do it? I predict we'll be laughing at Louise's funeral, but there will be.
You're only going to be familiar with you know well.
I'll say in closing, the hardest thing about the last couple of years is now I'm saying goodbye to friends, right? People that I've known for a long time and that I've walked, and it's very different. Very different, yeah. So anyway, thanks again for your attention. Thanks, Faith, for keeping me in line.